The courtroom smelled of old wood and broken promises. Thomas Anderson sat at the defendant's table, his calloused hands folded on the polished surface, watching his wife of 17 years testify under oath. Sarah wore a cream-colored blouse that made her look angelic under the fluorescent lights. Her voice trembled with practiced vulnerability as she described years of emotional abuse, financial control, and isolation. "He never let me work," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Every penny I spent, he questioned. Every friend I made, he drove away. I lived in fear, Your Honor. Fear of his anger, his control, his violence." Thomas felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom turn toward him. Judge Patricia Holloway, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back tight, studied him over her reading glasses. His lawyer, Marcus Chun, a young public defender with too many cases and too little time, scribbled notes but said nothing. Marcus had already warned him. Family court favored mothers, especially ones who claimed abuse. The house sat at the center of everything. Not just any house, the 3-bedroom colonial on Maple Street that Thomas had built with his own hands. Every board, every nail, every window frame had been installed during weekends and summer evenings after his shifts at the construction company. His father had helped him pour the foundation before the cancer took him. His mother had planted the rose bushes along the front walk before her stroke. That house wasn't just property. It was 20 years of his life, solidified in brick and mortar. Sarah wanted it all. The house, the savings account, the truck, even his father's antique tools in the garage. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Victoria Reeves, had presented a compelling case. Sarah had sacrificed her career to support Thomas's dreams, had endured years of psychological torment, and now deserved compensation for her suffering. "Mr. Anderson controlled every aspect of my client's life," Victoria said during her opening statement. "He isolated her from family, monitored her phone calls, and made her account for every moment of her day. This is a textbook case of coercive control." Thomas had listened to the lies stack up like cordwood. Some were twisted versions of truth. Yes, he'd questioned expenses when they were drowning in medical bills after his mother's stroke. Yes, he'd asked about her new friends when she started coming home at midnight smelling of wine and cologne that wasn't his. But violence, control, the words didn't match the reality he'd lived. What the court didn't know, what Sarah didn't know Thomas knew, was that she'd been planning this for months. The affair with Derek Lansing, her yoga instructor. The secret credit cards she'd opened in both their names, maxing them out on jewelry and vacations she'd taken to visit her sister. The consultation with Victoria Reeves that had happened 6 months before Sarah ever mentioned divorce. Thomas had discovered it all by accident. A forgotten email left open on the home computer. A credit card statement delivered to the house instead of her P.O. box. Pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, showed a picture of calculated betrayal. But he'd done something Sarah hadn't expected. He'd started documenting everything. Not with anger or confrontation, those would have tipped her off. With silence and a small digital recorder he'd purchased at an electronics store 40 miles from home. Now, as Sarah wept on the witness stand, describing a husband who'd never existed, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and felt the small device. Its weight was insignificant, but what it contained could change everything. Judge Holloway cleared her throat. "Mrs. Anderson, you've stated that your husband was financially abusive. Can you provide specific examples?" Sarah nodded, her performance flawless. "He kept all our bank statements hidden. I never knew how much money we had. When I asked, he'd become angry, accusatory. He said I was irresponsible, that I couldn't be trusted with money. Meanwhile, I was living on a $20 weekly allowance while he spent whatever he wanted. It was masterful fiction." Thomas felt Marcus shift beside him, uncertain. They'd gone over Thomas's version of events, but in family court, emotion often trumped evidence. Sarah's tears were her strongest weapon. "Your Honor," Victoria said, standing, "we're requesting that the marital home be awarded solely to Mrs. Anderson, along with 50% of all retirement accounts, the 2019 Ford pickup, and monthly spousal support of $3,000. Mrs. Anderson gave up her career opportunities to support her husband. She deserves security after years of psychological abuse. Thomas closed his eyes. $3,000 a month would bankrupt him. The house alone represented every sacrifice he'd made since he was 23 years old. And the truth, the real truth, sat in his pocket, waiting. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "They're killing us. Unless you have something concrete, we're going to lose everything." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. For a moment, their gazes met across the courtroom. He saw something flicker in her expression. Uncertainty, maybe fear. She'd been so careful, so methodical in her planning. But everyone makes mistakes. "I have something," Thomas whispered back. The judge was shuffling papers, preparing to move forward with witness testimony. The court reporter's fingers danced across her stenography machine. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Thomas Anderson, carpenter and builder, son of a man who'd taught him that truth was the only foundation worth building on, made his decision. Thomas had met Sarah at a community college art class 19 years ago. He'd been 25, working full-time construction and taking night classes because his mother insisted education mattered. Sarah had been 23, painting abstract pieces that looked like emotions given form. She'd laughed at his terrible attempt at pottery, a lopsided bowl that collapsed in the kiln, and he'd fallen for that laugh like a man stepping off a cliff. Their early years were filled with small joys. Weekend drives to the coast. Friday night dinners at the diner on Route 9 where they'd split a piece of cherry pie. The way she'd sketch his profile while he read the newspaper, her pencil scratching softly against paper. He'd proposed in that same art studio, ring hidden in a ball of clay, and she'd cried real tears then, tears of happiness. The house had been their shared dream. Sarah had designed the kitchen layout, insisting on a window over the sink so she could watch birds at the feeder while washing dishes. Thomas had built a reading nook in the master bedroom because she loved curling up with novels on rainy afternoons. Every room held memories of who they'd been before everything turned dark. The change had been gradual, like rot spreading through wood. Started 3 years ago when Sarah joined the yoga studio downtown. She'd been battling depression after her mother's death, and Thomas had encouraged her to find something for herself. The classes helped at first. She seemed lighter, more energetic. But then came the late nights, the new wardrobe, the way she'd guard her phone like it held nuclear launch codes. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Thomas had tried to talk to her. Gentle questions over dinner that she'd deflect with irritation. Suggestions for couples therapy that she'd dismiss as unnecessary. He'd felt her slipping away but hadn't known how to hold on without pushing her further. The night he'd discovered the truth had been a Tuesday in March. Sarah had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. Thomas had gone to the home computer to pay bills and found her email still open. He hadn't meant to snoop, or maybe he had some instinct telling him to look. The messages from Derek Lansing filled the screen. Intimate conversations. Plans to meet at a hotel. Discussions about finally being together once the divorce was finalized. Thomas had sat in the blue glow of the monitor for an hour, reading through months of correspondence. The pain had been physical, a weight pressing on his chest. But beneath the pain was something else. Clarity. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. It was a calculated exit strategy. That's when he'd started recording. Not everything, just the moments when Sarah revealed her true intentions. The phone calls with Victoria Reeves, discussing how to maximize her settlement. The conversations with Derek about getting everything he deserves to lose. The afternoon she told her sister, Julie, that she'd finally found a way out with enough money to start fresh. Thomas wasn't proud of the surveillance. It felt like a betrayal of the privacy that marriages were supposed to hold sacred. But Sarah had betrayed something deeper. The fundamental trust that two people build a life on. He'd spent weeks wrestling with his conscience, the recorder a small weight in his pocket, before deciding that truth. Documented, irrefutable truth was the only weapon he had. Work had become his refuge. Thomas poured himself into projects, building decks and framing houses with a ferocity that made his coworkers keep their distance. His boss, Jimmy Torrance, had pulled him aside one afternoon. "You trying to build your way through something, Tommy?" Jimmy had asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Just keeping busy," Thomas had replied. "Busy's good, but running yourself into the ground ain't. Whatever you're dealing with, don't lose yourself in it." But Thomas had already felt lost. The man he'd been, the one who'd believed in the permanence of vows and the sanctity of shared dreams, was gone. In his place was someone harder, more cautious. Someone who checked bank statements and recorded conversations and slept on the couch because the marital bed felt like enemy territory. His friend Ray had offered to testify, to tell the court about Sarah's affair, but Thomas had declined. Adultery didn't matter much in no-fault divorce states, and he couldn't prove it anyway. The emails had been deleted by the time he'd thought to save them. All he had were the recordings, hours of audio that painted a picture of premeditated deception. The hardest part was the loneliness. Thomas had always been a private person, not given to sharing his troubles. His mother was gone. His father was gone. His sister lived in Oregon with her own family. The house on Maple Street, once filled with laughter and music, had become a mausoleum of better days. At night, after Sarah had moved to her lawyer's recommendation into the spare room, Thomas would walk through the rooms he'd built. The kitchen where they'd cooked their first Thanksgiving turkey. The living room where they'd hosted Christmas parties. The back porch where they'd watched fireflies on summer evenings. Each space whispered of what had been lost. He'd thought about giving up, just signing the papers, walking away, starting over somewhere new. But every time he considered it, he'd think of his father's hands on his shoulders, teaching him how to square a corner, how to check measurements twice, how to build things that lasted. "Measure twice, cut once," his father had always said. "And never walk away from your work." The house wasn't just his work. It was his father's legacy, his mother's memory, his own sweat and blood transformed into shelter. He couldn't walk away, not without fighting. So Thomas sat in that courtroom, listening to his wife lie under oath, and waited for his moment. The trial stretched into its second day. Judge Holloway called for Sarah's continued testimony, and Victoria Reeves stood with the confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. "Mrs. Anderson," Victoria began, "can you describe the incident last September when your husband destroyed your personal belongings?" Sarah's eyes welled up on cue. "I'd bought some new clothes, just a few things to feel good about myself." When Thomas saw the shopping bags, he became enraged. He took the clothes and threw them in the backyard. Then she paused, her voice breaking. "Then he burned them, while I watched. He said I was wasting his money on vanity." The courtroom stirred. Thomas felt the weight of judgment settling over him like fog. He wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that those few things had been $1,200 charged to a credit card he'd just discovered, that he'd never burned anything, that the whole story was fiction designed to paint him as unstable. Marcus scribbled a note. "Did this happen?" Thomas wrote back, "Complete lie." But it was his word against hers, and Sarah's performance was Oscar-worthy. Victoria continued, "Your Honor, we have documentation of Mrs. Anderson's mental health treatment following years of emotional abuse. Anxiety, depression, PTSD symptoms consistent with domestic psychological trauma. She presented medical records. Thomas had seen them before. Therapy sessions Sarah had started 6 months ago, right when she'd begun planning the divorce. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. She'd built her case brick by brick. Every doctor's visit another piece of evidence. "The psychological impact of Mr. Anderson's behavior," Victoria said, "has been devastating. Mrs. Anderson requires ongoing treatment. She's unable to work due to the trauma she's experienced. The court must consider this when determining spousal support." Judge Holloway made notes. "Mr. Chun, does your client wish to respond to these allegations?" Marcus stood, young and uncertain against Victoria's polished aggression. "Your Honor, Mr. Anderson denies all allegations of abuse. We believe Mrs. Anderson's claims are exaggerated and motivated by financial gain." "Belief isn't evidence, counselor," the judge replied coolly. Sarah's sister, Julie, testified next. She corroborated Sarah's stories, describing how Thomas had, isolated Sarah from family. "We barely saw her anymore," Julie said, her voice tight with anger. "When we did, she seemed afraid, always checking her phone, worrying about what Thomas would say if she stayed too long." It was masterful construction, a narrative built from half-truths and strategic omissions. Yes, Sarah had been distant, but because she'd been conducting an affair, not because Thomas had forbidden family contact. Yes, she'd checked her phone constantly, but to hide Derek's messages, not from fear of her husband. Thomas's own witnesses were less effective. Jimmy Torrance testified that Thomas was a good man, reliable, never showed signs of anger or violence. But he admitted he'd never been to Thomas's home, never seen Thomas and Sarah interact as a couple. During her closing argument on day 2, "This is a classic case of financial abuse paired with psychological control. Mr. Anderson systematically stripped my client of autonomy, independence, and dignity. The evidence is overwhelming. Mrs. Anderson deserves not just the marital home, but substantial support as she rebuilds a life her husband spent 17 years destroying." Thomas watched the judge's face for any sign of doubt, any indication that she saw through the performance. But Judge Holloway's expression remained neutral, professional. That evening, sitting in a cheap motel room because Sarah had changed the locks on the house, with the court's permission, pending the final ruling, Thomas reviewed his recordings. Hours of audio, some clear, some muffled. Conversations he'd captured over 4 months, each one revealing another layer of Sarah's deception. The most damaging was from 6 weeks ago. Sarah had been on the phone with Victoria, believing Thomas was at work. He'd come home early, sick with the flu, and heard her voice drifting from the upstairs bedroom. "I don't care about truth," Sarah had said, her voice sharp, calculating. Nothing like the fragile woman who'd testified under oath. "I care about winning. Thomas built that house, fine. But I've earned it by putting up with 17 years of mediocrity. He's boring, Victoria. Predictable. Derek makes me feel alive. And if I have to paint Thomas as a monster to get what I deserve, so be it. He'll never fight back. He's too passive, too concerned with being the good guy." Thomas had stood in the downstairs hallway, recorder running in his pocket, feeling something inside him crystallize into resolve. Ray Mitchell, Thomas's friend since high school, described Sarah as cold in recent years, but under Victoria's cross-examination, he conceded he'd only seen her at occasional barbecues. "You're not a marriage counselor, are you, Mr. Mitchell?" Victoria had asked with a smile that was all teeth. The financial evidence came next. Victoria presented bank statements showing Thomas's name on all accounts, credit cards in his name only, Sarah's lack of access to financial information. It looked damning, until Marcus pointed out that Sarah had insisted Thomas handle the finances because she didn't have a head for numbers. She'd said it herself multiple times before the marriage soured. But memory is selective, and Sarah now claimed those had been Thomas's words, not hers. "Your Honor," Victoria said, "there were other recordings. Sarah telling Derek she'd invented some of the abuse stories to strengthen her case. Sarah laughing with Julie about how easy it was to manipulate court perception. Sarah discussing with Victoria how they'd time her therapy sessions to build a medical paper trail. Each recording was a small bomb. Together, they were a nuclear arsenal. Marcus had listened to them once, his eyes widening. "This changes everything," he'd said. "But introducing them, it's complicated." She didn't consent to being recorded. Depending on the judge's interpretation, they might not be admissible. "They're recorded in my own home," Thomas had replied. "In a shared space. I looked it up. That's legal." "Legal, yes, but family court judges have discretion. Judge Holloway might view this as ethically questionable." Thomas had looked at his lawyer, this kid fresh out of law school trying to navigate a system that seemed rigged from the start. "I'm not letting her steal my life based on lies. If the judge won't hear the truth, what's the point of any of this?" Now, on the 3rd day of trial, as the final arguments approached, Thomas felt the recorder in his pocket like a heartbeat. Outside the courthouse, the autumn leaves were turning gold and red, falling in slow spirals to the ground. Inside, The battle for his life's work was reaching its conclusion. Judge Holloway called the court to order. We'll hear closing arguments today. Then I'll take the matter under advisement and render a decision within 48 hours. Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Mrs. Anderson has endured years of abuse, control, and manipulation. She deserves. Your Honor, Thomas said, standing abruptly. Marcus grabbed his arm, but Thomas shook him off. I have evidence the court needs to hear. The courtroom went silent. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Mr. Anderson, you'll speak through your attorney or not at all. Your Honor, Marcus said quickly, recovering. My client has audio recordings that directly contradict Mrs. Anderson's testimony. Victoria's face went pale. Sarah's eyes widened, confusion and fear flashing across her features. Recordings. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Explain. Marcus approached the bench with the small digital recorder, his hands slightly trembling. Your Honor, these recordings were made by Mr. Anderson in his own home over a period of 4 months. They capture conversations between Mrs. Anderson and her attorney, Mrs. Anderson and her sister, and Mrs. Anderson and a third party that directly contradict her sworn testimony. Victoria shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is ambush tactics. We weren't informed of any recordings during discovery. I move to have this evidence excluded. Judge Holloway held up a hand. Mrs. Reeves, please. Mr. Chun, why wasn't this disclosed earlier? Marcus swallowed. Mr. Anderson only recently decided to present this evidence, Your Honor. He struggled with the ethical implications of recording his wife without her knowledge. As he should have, Victoria snapped. This is a violation of privacy, possibly illegal, and certainly inadmissible. Judge Holloway studied the recorder, then looked at Thomas. For the first time since the trial began, he saw something shift in her expression. Curiosity, maybe, or the possibility of doubt. Mr. Anderson, she said. Stand up. Thomas rose, his heart hammering. Did you record your wife without her knowledge in your shared home? Yes, Your Honor. Why? Thomas took a breath. This was the moment everything hinged on. Because she was lying, Your Honor, about everything, and I needed to prove it. Truth obtained through deception, Judge Holloway said quietly. A philosophical dilemma as old as law itself. She was silent for a long moment, the courtroom holding its collective breath. Finally, she spoke. I'm going to allow the recordings under the marital communication exception. This court's primary concern is truth, particularly in matters involving substantial asset division and allegations of abuse. We'll listen in chambers. Counsels, with me. Court will recess for 1 hour. Sarah's face had gone from pale to gray. She leaned toward Victoria, whispering urgently, but Victoria's expression was grim. They both knew what was coming. In Judge Holloway's chambers, a space lined with law books and smelling of old leather, the 4 attorneys, Thomas, Sarah, and the judge gathered around a conference table. The court reporter positioned her machine. The judge pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the room, clear and cold. I don't care about truth. I care about winning. Thomas built that house, fine. But I've earned it by putting up with 17 years of mediocrity. Thomas watched Sarah's face as she heard herself. The color drained completely. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. The recording continued. Victoria's face darkened as she heard herself in the background, laughing at Sarah's description of Thomas as too passive to fight back. Judge Holloway played 3 more recordings. Sarah telling Derek about inventing abuse stories. Sarah discussing with Julie how to make herself cry on command before testifying. Sarah planning with Victoria how to maximize her settlement through strategic medical documentation. When the final recording ended, the silence in the chamber was absolute. Judge Holloway removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she looked up, her gaze was steel. Mrs. Anderson, you committed perjury in my courtroom. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. You manufactured evidence, coached witnesses, and filed false allegations of abuse. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? Your Honor, Sarah's voice cracked. I was emotional. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to systematically lie under oath? Judge Holloway's voice was ice. You didn't mean to weaponize abuse allegations, trivializing the real suffering of actual victims? You didn't mean to attempt to defraud this court and your husband. Victoria tried to intervene. Your Honor, my client was under duress. Counselor, I suggest you be very quiet right now. I'm considering whether to refer you to the state bar for ethics violations. Victoria paled and sat down. Judge Holloway turned to Thomas. Mr. Anderson, while I don't condone secret recordings, you've presented evidence of substantial fraud. I'm ruling in your favor on all counts. The marital home remains yours. You owe no spousal support. Asset division will reflect your contributions to the marriage. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. You can't. That's not fair. Fair. Judge Holloway's voice could have cut glass. You want to discuss fair after lying to this court for 3 days? Mrs. Anderson, I'm holding you in contempt. Bailiff, take her into custody. The bailiff, who'd been standing by the door, moved forward. Sarah's eyes went wild. Wait, no, Your Honor, please. You'll be held pending investigation into perjury charges. The district attorney will review these recordings and determine whether to file criminal charges. As the bailiff placed handcuffs on Sarah's wrists, she turned to Thomas, her mask completely shattered. What he saw beneath wasn't the woman he'd married. It was someone he'd never really known, someone capable of calculated cruelty disguised as victimhood. Thomas, she said, tears streaming now, real ones finally. Please, don't let them do this. We can work it out. I made mistakes, but you tried to destroy me, Thomas said quietly. Based on lies, in front of a judge. You turned our marriage into a weapon. Sarah was led from the chamber, her sobs echoing down the hallway. Victoria Reeves gathered her papers in silence, her career possibly in ruins. Marcus sat beside Thomas, looking shell-shocked by the reversal. Judge Holloway turned to Thomas one final time. Mr. Anderson, I'll have the final orders drawn up by tomorrow. You're free to return to your home immediately. I'll also order Mrs. Anderson to cover your legal fees and court costs. Thank you, Your Honor. As Thomas left the courthouse that afternoon, the autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. His phone buzzed, Jimmy, asking how the trial had gone. Ray offering to buy him a beer. The world continued, indifferent to the small drama that had unfolded in that courtroom. But for Thomas Anderson, everything had changed. He'd learned that marriage could be a lie, that trust could be weaponized, that sometimes the person sleeping beside you was a stranger wearing a familiar face. He'd also learned that truth, however painful to obtain, was the only foundation worth standing on. He drove to Maple Street, parking in the driveway of the house he'd built with his own hands. The rose bushes his mother had planted were blooming late, their red petals defiant against the coming winter. The windows glowed warm in the twilight. Thomas unlocked the door and stepped inside. He was home. The perjury charges were filed 2 weeks later. The district attorney, a serious woman named Patricia Vance, had reviewed the recordings and deemed them clear evidence of criminal fraud. Sarah pleaded guilty to 3 counts of perjury in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and a permanent mark on her record. Victoria Reeves faced a state bar ethics investigation. While she wasn't criminally charged, her role in coaching a client to commit perjury resulted in a 6-month suspension of her law license and mandatory ethics training. Her prestigious family law practice took a significant hit as clients questioned her integrity. Thomas attended Sarah's sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because he needed to see the final chapter close. Sarah stood before Judge Holloway in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, all traces of the composed woman from the trial erased. Mrs. Anderson, Judge Holloway said, you weaponized the legal system against an innocent man. You trivialized real abuse, making it harder for actual victims to be believed. Your actions were calculated, malicious, and devastating. I hope you use your time in custody to reflect on the damage you've caused. Sarah read a prepared statement, apologizing to Thomas, the court, and anyone I may have hurt. The words sounded hollow, rehearsed by her new attorney. Thomas felt nothing hearing them. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. After the hearing, Derek Lansing approached him in the courthouse hallway. The yoga instructor looked diminished in the harsh fluorescent light, his practiced charm absent. I didn't know, Derek said. About the lies, she told me you were abusive, that she was scared. I believed her. Thomas studied the man his wife had chosen over him. She lied to everyone, including you. Derek nodded, looking down. I'm sorry, for my part in it. Your part was believing you could build something good on someone else's wreckage, Thomas said. You should think about that. He walked away, leaving Derek standing alone in the hallway. Thomas returned to work the following Monday. Jimmy Torrance clapped him on the back. Heard you won. Glad you got your house back, Tommy. Thanks, Jimmy. You doing okay? After everything. Thomas considered the question. Was he okay? He'd won the legal battle but lost the 17-year investment of his heart. The house felt emptier than before, haunted by memories of a love that had been real once, or at least he'd believed it was. I'm getting there, he said finally. Work helped. Thomas threw himself into projects with renewed focus. He built a deck for an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, listening to their stories about weathering hard times together. He framed a garage for a young family with 2 kids, watching the parents laugh as their children played in the yard. Each project reminded him that not all marriages ended in courtroom betrayals, that love could last. Ray convinced him to join a woodworking class at the community center. Thomas found unexpected peace in the craft. The smell of sawdust, the satisfaction of transforming rough lumber into something beautiful and functional. He built a bench for his front porch, a bookshelf for his bedroom, small acts of creation that felt like healing. 6 months after the trial, Julie reached out. Sarah's sister sent a hesitant email. I know I testified against you. I believed Sarah. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Thomas wrote back. You loved your sister. That's not wrong. But you should have verified her claims before helping her hurt someone. Julie replied, You're right. I've learned a hard lesson about blind loyalty. For what it's worth, Sarah knows what she did was unforgivable. She asked me to tell you she's truly sorry, though she knows that doesn't fix anything. Thomas didn't respond to that message. Sarah's apology, delivered secondhand, felt like another manipulation, an attempt to ease her conscience more than repair the damage. 1 year after the trial, Thomas sold his father's antique tools, not out of necessity, but because keeping them felt like clinging to a past that no longer existed. He donated the money to a legal aid organization that helped men navigate family court, wanting to prevent others from facing similar battles without resources. The house on Maple Street slowly transformed. Thomas repainted the kitchen, replacing Sarah's color choices with earth tones that felt more like him. He converted the spare bedroom, the one Sarah had slept in during their final months, into a workshop. He planted new flowers in the garden, creating something that was entirely his. Dating wasn't on his radar. Friends tried to set him up, but Thomas demurred. The thought of trusting someone that deeply again felt impossible. Maybe someday, but not yet. First, he needed to remember who he was outside of the marriage, outside of the courtroom battle. He'd learned that trust, once shattered, left sharp edges that took time to smooth. He'd learned that people could lie with tears in their eyes and conviction in their voices. He'd learned that truth, while powerful, was also lonely. A weapon that protected you but isolated you from those who preferred comfortable fictions. Most importantly, he'd learned that his father had been right. Measure twice, cut once, and never walk away from your work. The house stood solid, a testament to honest labor and genuine craftsmanship. Unlike his marriage, it wouldn't betray him. Thomas Anderson, 44 years old, carpenter and survivor, sat on his front porch as evening fell. The rose bushes bloomed red in the fading light. The house behind him was quiet but no longer empty. It was filled with his presence, his choices, his future. He'd built something that would last. 3 years later, Thomas received a letter from Sarah. She'd been released from jail after serving her full sentence, her probation ongoing. The envelope sat on his kitchen table for 2 days before he opened it. Dear Thomas, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that prison gave me time to face what I'd become. I was selfish, cruel, and cowardly. I tried to destroy a good man because I was too weak to be honest about my own unhappiness. You built our house with your hands. I tried to steal it with lies. That difference says everything about who we are. I'm living with Julie now, working as a cashier, trying to rebuild a life from honest work. It's humbling. It's what I should have done years ago instead of looking for easy exits. I hope you found peace. You deserved better than what I gave you. Sarah. Thomas read the letter twice, then filed it away in a drawer. It didn't change the past, but it acknowledged it truthfully for the first time. That was something. He'd started dating recently. A woman named Elena who taught middle school and had a laugh that reminded him of what joy sounded like. It was early, cautious, but real. She knew his story, all of it, and hadn't run. That meant something too. The house on Maple Street stood solid, its foundation true. Thomas had built a life inside it that was entirely his own, simple, honest, hard one. On quiet evenings, he'd sit on the porch and listen to the world. Birds settling in for the night, neighbors calling their children home, the distant sound of traffic on the highway. He'd learned that survival wasn't the same as victory, but it was enough. Some battles left you scarred but standing. Some truths cost everything to tell but were worth the price. Thomas Anderson, builder of homes and protector of truth, had weathered the storm and remained. The house stood. The man inside it stood taller. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.